Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Rick Eisted. For those of you who may not know me, I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Calgary Fish Creek. I also sit on the District Learning and Development Committee, responsible for our monthly club learning webinars program, which we've decided to continue again for this year. And this is really our first one. We've decided to run 10 of them over the course of September to June. And I will be your Zoom host for this evening. I would like to welcome and thank everyone for attending. As I mentioned earlier, we have close to 60 people registered, and I'm hoping we'll have certainly about 75% of you join us this evening. Um, tonight's webinar is entitled Beyond Seagull Development, and I know for sure you're going to enjoy what our presenters, Judie and Michael Bopp, have to say. I will more formally introduce them a little later, referring to the bios that they sent me earlier today, or yesterday, I guess. Tonight's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and it is being recorded, and everyone will receive a link to the recording on our district YouTube channel, probably a week from now. Live transcription has been activated, and if you want to see what's being said on your screen, look for a live transcription button. In mine, it should be somewhere on your screen, and it should be with a CC on it, and then you'll be able to take part in the live transcription. And we can record that for later points of reference. Everyone's audio and video has been turned off except for our panelist and myself. I would ask you to kindly use the chat button if you want to communicate with each other or individuals or as the group. And if you could, use the Q&A button to ask questions, and we will allow our presenters to deliver their message first, and hopefully within the last 10 or so minutes, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, and I'm sure there will be some. So I now would like to introduce Michael and Judie and just read some pieces that I pulled out of their bio that I received. So Michael and Judie are both members of the Rotary Club of Cochrane. Michael is the International Projects Committee Director, and Judie is a member of that committee. Judie is also the chairperson of the District 5360 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And to keep Michael out of trouble, he serves on the District Indigenous Relations Committee. Both Michael and Judie have PhDs in fields related to learning and change for development. Both have more than 30 years of experience carrying out development-related projects in more than 25 countries, as well as extensively in Indigenous Canada. Both have authored and co-authored many books and articles, as well as an extension array of learning materials oriented to solving critical human problems and building capacity for sustainable well-being and prosperity. I learned quite a bit about this couple as a result of their bios, and each time I meet with them, I can tell you I always learn something new. So with that, I'd like to introduce Michael and Judie Bopp, and I'll now share my screen and they can begin their presentation.
Well, hello, everybody. It's really wonderful to have a chance to have a conversation, I hope, with you. And I hope that what comes of this conversation carries on beyond a seminar into the work that all of us are doing in communities and in the world. The title of this presentation, Judie and I will alternate between the sections of our presentation. So the title, Seagull, Beyond Seagull Development, comes from a comment by one of our international development team members from Cochrane, who said, well, the kind of development we don't want to do is like the seagull who comes in and swoops down and drops shit on people and flies away. We don't want to do that. We want to be the kind of people that spend time on the ground and build capacity of people for long-term progress that's kind of within their own capacity to direct and control and guide. So then
Can
we're
we
really
have the slide 2, please, Rick?
hello, Rick.
Yeah, just hang on. I'm trying to, I don't know why it's not advancing. Let me come out and come back in.
Okay, sure.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between charity and development. Essentially, charity is giving people stuff, and development is building the capacity of people to do things for themselves and to build their own pathways for a better life. And the kind of development that the Rotary International is really trying to push the Rotary world toward is this second kind. Charity is much easier to do. It's much easier to go into a community and bring something like a water system or solar power or to fix up a school or lots of things like that, and then leave. Much easier than to spend day in and day out, year in, year out, helping people to learn, building their institutions, building their capacity to do projects, to carry on businesses. That's a very different kettle of fish, as we're going to explain to you. Advance the slide.
Slide 3, please.
There's a couple of slides you're going to see here. These are just what we think are really not very good development projects. These people came up with the idea that you could have a water pump that would be run by a children's merry-go-round. Children would play on the merry-go-round and they'd make the thing go round and round and round, and it would pump the water out, and voila, the whole village would have water. Well, there's dozens of these things all over Africa sitting there not doing anything because it didn't work for all kinds of reasons. But the main reason is because they didn't talk to the community before they did it.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide is a picture of a guy that worked exactly in the area that we are working in Pakistan now. His name is Greg Mortensen. His book, 3 Cups of Tea, is known by a lot of people. His story is that he was a mountaineer and got lost and then came down the mountain and ended up in villages in northern Pakistan. It's high Himalayan mountains there, and discovered, oh, these people don't have schools. They don't have anything hardly. I'm going to do a charity that will, but it turns out that there were lots of schools already there. And quite a lot of misconstruence that happened as a result of not really listening again to the people, not really working behind and with the people. Next slide. So, when we came to northern Pakistan, there's a long story about how we got there, but when we sat with leaders, they told us that they'd had lots of projects, and the projects that came and went never left them much different. When the money ran out and the project was done, they'd look around and say, like, well, what happened? Like, the vulnerable people were not reached. A lot of us are dependent and we're looking for more help from the outside. We can't sustain it. We don't have the resources to do it. All the solutions they brought came from the outside. Our own thinking, our own creativity, our own energy, our own knowledge was not involved really at all. How do you scale that up? How do you make that something bigger? Next slide. Judy.
So what do we mean by development? I mean, it's a word that we use in the field all the time. One way to think about it is just to think about its antecedent in the word développer from French, which means opening up. You can see that flower there is opening up. Envelopper is enclosing, but développer is opening up. So we can say that development is the unfolding of potential. Next slide. So our working definition of development is building the capacity of people, communities, and institutions to address the fundamental determinants of sustainable well-being and prosperity. So the picture you see here actually is from Pakistan, and community people have come to this workshop, and they put on their very best. They're really excited about thinking about working together to analyze their context and to think about what are those determinants of well-being and prosperity, and how do we enter into that rather than waiting for somebody to bring us things? Next slide. It's not moving forward, Rick. Great. Okay, so we're just going to quickly go over 4 principles of development. Next slide. The first one is that without participation, there's no development. You can't develop people. They develop from the inside out. It doesn't mean that you don't support and assist, but so we can think about development projects that we've known, and their idea about participation can be very different. One is doing a survey and asking people something, and people just give information. That's very passive. Another is you collaborate, you work together. But a whole nother level is communities actually self-mobilizing. They have the control, and outside people are supporting and helping. Next slide. So another principle about development is vision. So we say without some vision of where we want to go, we can't get there. So vision works like a magnet. It pulls us to that future that we are wanting. And it's not always easy to envision when you feel trapped, when you feel powerless, and when you don't see any way out of the situation that you're in. Next slide, please. The third principle is that individual and collective development go hand in hand. So I could tell you more detailed stories about this wonderful young girl that's there and who just had this spirit. She was going to come to Canada and get university because she's wants to develop her potential. She may well be there now because this picture was taken back in 2011. And collective development. This was the first women's conference that was ever held in the area. And so building the capacity of a collective, and that can be a group of women like this, or it can be an institution. Next. But in all cases, learning is the driver of development. It's fundamentally without being able to enter into new ways of thinking and doing and being, then you're just going to recreate the world that you have now. So learning is a key process. Next.
So I'm going to talk in a second about what develops in development, but I just want to mention, why are we telling you this stuff? Like, we could just show you pictures of projects in Belize and in Pakistan, other places that we have done or are doing, but the reason we're showing you things about principle, things about definitions, basic concepts that underlie the work that we do, is because it's a mind map that you sort of have to have in your head, because when you approach a community and you start trying to work with them, you don't know anybody, you don't know anything. There are certain things that you really need to look for. You need to engage people about certain things in certain ways. And otherwise what you do is look around and say, oh, they don't have a water system, let's give them that. Or, oh, they don't have schools, let's build a school. But those things may not be at all at the root of what that community needs for long-term moving ahead. Next slide. So we work a lot, have worked for many years with Indigenous people, and this circle is called a medicine wheel. It can represent the whole of anything, the whole family, the whole community, the whole person. So you could, and the 4 points on the circle can symbolically are used to represent, well, a person has mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual capacities. And so all of those capacities need to be activated and developed in human development. A family or a community has, well, a community, let's say, has political or administrative capacity, economic or environmental relationship to the land, that capacity, social relationships, cultural and spiritual values relationships, all of those things, and they interplay to create the pattern of life that's in the community when you find it. And so when you're dealing with in a development problem and you start trying to work with people, you don't even know them. You're not actually, you think you're looking at a few people sitting in a room and having a meeting, but you're really looking at something much more complex. Next slide. So here we have the medicine wheels again, the circles, but one within the other. So the middle circle is the individual. The next one out could be the family. The next one out could be the community. The next one out could be the clan, the tribe, or the nation, or the region. We just are using 4 here, but even 4, because each one of these has 4 variables inside of it, like political, economic, social, and cultural, mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual. These are all domains of development. These are all stuff that have to be developed. So how complicated is it? Well, it's 16, the combination and permutation of 16. And so that's why I wrote down on the bottom there, 6 times 10 to the 13th power. That's the level of complexity, which is like 6 with 13 zeros. It's a lot. It's big. Let's just put it that way. It's big. One woman in a workshop, when she was looking at all of this, and she goes, no damn wonder we can't fix it. But in fact, people do. Things
Next slide.
What?
Oh, I just was going to say next slide.
Yeah, it's complex, but it's not impossible. Go ahead, Judy.
Exactly. So this is just a little quotation that we think of. You know, for every complex problem, there's an answer that's clear, simple, and wrong. And those are maybe are the answers that the Seagull brings, but also that we can jump to quick conclusions about what we're seeing and what would make a difference. Next slide. So we just refer to this. It's a very interesting book called Getting to Maybe. And it's not about negotiation. It says how the world has changed. And these are the authors in case anyone wants to look it up. Next slide. So an analogy that they use in the book is saying that change is, you can think about it this way. So you're a fantastic kayaker, and you get your kayak into water like this, and you look at it beforehand, and you see where there's the rocks sticking out, you see where there's the eddies and so on. And so you kind of have a plan about how you're going to navigate this water. But you have to be prepared when you actually get into the water and put your paddle in. There's all sorts of stuff happening underneath what you could see. And the only way that you can read that pattern and keep yourself safe is to be able to feel those patterns and adapt and dance with the water, so to speak. Next slide. So they go on to say that we can think about 3 kinds of change. Simple change, it's like following a recipe, baking a cake, for example. That's pretty simple. You know, we can more or less get the same result if we do the same process. And, you know, maybe some of us struggle to get a cake, but really, if we do the recipe, we can get a cake. Next slide. Complicated is really just a bunch of recipes and protocols and so on. So it's like building a rocket ship. It's way more complex or complicated than making a cake, but still you're following known protocols and procedures. Next slide. Complex change processes. For any of you that have had kids or have kids or are watching your grandchildren, it's like raising a child or solving these kinds of issues that the world is facing, like climate change and human rights abuses and so on. It's complex. You can't just follow a recipe. So the question then becomes, what do you do? Next slide. So here's just another example of, I don't know if you've heard of the Millennium Village Project. Jeffrey Sachs was a guy who wrote a book called An End to Poverty. And he had this idea, if you just take a community and you give it enough that it has what it needs, you will end poverty. So you give it a school, you give it a hospital, you give it a water system, whatever. But it didn't work because there's lots more complexity. The fact that they were making decisions from Columbia University about what were all those things that people needed. The fact that they were creating whole institutions and systems that just overlooked the fact that people already had traditional governance systems and ways of doing things and so on, meant that it was a failure. Millions of dollars were invested in this project by the World Bank and other sources, but it was simple, neat, and wrong. Next slide. So one way to think about it is that you can think about development as a ladder that's got two uprights. One of them is strengthening human resources, so building the capacity of people. But then if it doesn't translate into new patterns of community life, then it's not going anywhere. Both of those things have to happen at once. And then we can think about rungs on that ladder in terms of steps that we take to do that. And I won't read all of these things, but you start with something basic like people just learning to work together. Our project in police, when we were there last fall, that's what the people said that had happened during the startup of the project. Through the training process, they learned to work together. They said, we never learned that before. It may sound simple, but we learned, and this means that we're going to trust each other and our projects are going to work. They never worked before. So that's just a very starting point. You can see all the other steps here on the ladder, but you get to more and more complicated levels, but slowly that ladder of capacity that you saw before, you're getting to self-mobilization, you're getting to people taking control of their development process and building their own institutions and strengths. Next slide.
So I'm going to tell you about a project that we've been involved in Pakistan for going on, I think we're in our 13th year. And the kind of mind mapping, the modeling that we've just been explaining, now I'm going to show you how we actually did it on the ground and try to refer back to some of these ideas that we presented in the modeling part of it. First of all, we're two little old white people who showed up in northern Pakistan in a Muslim country, not knowing anybody. We ended up there because, well, we were helping another another white guy from Europe who was trying to do projects there, and we were on a study tour, and we were looking at different projects all over Pakistan and India, and we got invited to work here. That's a
Give me the next slide so that people can see just where you're talking about.
Okay, so you're seeing a map here on this thing, and Islamabad is kind of north central, and that's the capital of the country. Where we're working is all the way up to the top of the peninsula, where you see the word Gilgit there. That whole area is called Gilgit-Baltistan, and the very northern tip of it is called Hunza, and it's Himalayan mountains. Next slide. Like that. When you go to Banff National Park and you look at the mountains, you could take two mountains in Banff and stick them on top of each other, and you might reach the elevation of these things, which are 7,000, 8,000 meters. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's just staggering to the eye when you look at it. And people are living there somehow among these mountains, in the valleys, all over the place. Next slide. And they're living like this. They're making out of rocks, in this case, and just what's around. They're making a house. They're making shelters for cattle. Next slide. They're raising goats and yak, and that's about it, basically. They grow wheat and potatoes and apples and cherries and apricots. Next slide. This is an agricultural field. You see, they had to carve right out of the mountainside to make a flat place to grow. And then when the water comes down, they've got to channel that water so that it keeps breaking up. So they've got these, you can see the line, the bumps in the sand. It keeps pushing the water sideways instead of down. So the whole field gets washed without washing away. Next slide. And here's somebody's house and they're drying. This is just showing a little bit about how the people live. Next slide. But then as we were about to start working, long story about how we had a plan and we were going to go there and we were going to start working with a few villages and everything. And then there was a natural disaster. A landslide fell down into a valley. And this valley had a road going up it all the way from the center of the country to Islamabad, all the way up to China border. And then there was a river running alongside the road. And then this landslide came and it put a kilometer of rubble from one mountainside to the other mountainside. You could climb up a kilometer and down. That's how much rubble it was. And there was still a hell of a lot of mountain left over. And then the river began to back up and it formed a lake about 400 feet deep and 30 kilometers long. And pretty soon we ended up traveling on this high desert area in the mountains on these kind of boats. Next slide. And this is pictures of what's happening right now, like this month, this week, in the same area. Next slide. Okay, so we didn't know where to start. I'm telling this story, so we knew that we couldn't come in and just say, hi, we're from whatever, the Rotary, or I don't think we were Rotarians at that time. Anyway, we were here to help you. We basically invited community leaders to meet with us. Well, actually, they asked to meet with us. And we sat together with them, and it was November. The temperature outside was about minus 15 or 20. There was no electricity. It was foggy, miserable in this little mountain town. And we sat together, and they said, well, we want your help. And we said, well, what do you mean? What do you want? And they said, well, we want development. And we said, well, what is that? What do you mean by that? And they said, well, development. We're going to have education for our children and better economic development for our families and communities and better infrastructure like roads and water systems and access to knowledge. And they started naming off all the things that they wanted to have. And we said, all those things are the fruits of the tree of development. You can see this tree with the fruits on it. But what are the roots, we asked. What are the roots? And they said, oh, what do you mean? Well, we mean, what do you have to have in order to get those fruits? Like you're agricultural people. When you grow something, how do you grow these results? Well, we need training. We need a lot of education. We need better leaders. We need better community institutions. We need access to credit. And they went on and listed the things that they thought they needed. And we just listened to them and wrote it all down. And we said, all right, what you've said, that's what we'll work with you on. That will be our project. That will be our plan. But we need to tell you from the very beginning, we are not donors. We are partners. And we will stick with you. We will walk with you on this journey. But we can help our goal, what we're good at. We've worked in maybe 20 countries around the world. We help people to learn how to do their own development. And that's what we're willing to do with you. And if you want to do that, great. If you only want to wait around till somebody else comes and gives you money, that's not us. We'll just go away and go somewhere else. But they said, no, we've never had that offer before. We would love to work with you. And so on we went. Next slide. Am I supposed to keep going, Judy? Why don't you talk a little bit?
Sure. So, we just kind of developed 4 strategies for working on that tree of development. And the first one was igniting a spark of hope, because after that landslide, people were crying, people were weeping, people were saying, we don't know how 500 families lost everything. There was no way out. There was no way to get kids to higher education. There was no way to get access to medicine and help. There was no way to get your agricultural products to market or to get seeds and fertilizer. People said, we're hooped, basically. So igniting a spark of hope. And how do you do that? Well, one key is calling on traditional culture and values. So here, this is a traditional dance that nobody else had seen for years and years and years. It's called the hat dance, and it's a way of welcoming people. But so poetry, music, dancing. We linked people into their own spiritual tradition. These are, of course, Islamic people. It's the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Just all of these ways can unlock a sense of hope, a sense of purpose. So that's key. You don't get anywhere unless you have that.
Let me just
Go ahead.
read that Himmat poem.
Oh, yes, please do.
So what we were really trying to do is create a people's movement. Rather than a project, we were trying to create a movement. And you can tell that that's happening when people start inventing music and dancing and theater and songs and so on. And I'm going to read one poem. Remember that the word Himmat means perseverance in the face of difficulty, strength coming from within. So this is a poem that somebody wrote and stood up and read at one of our workshops. Himmat, Himmat can change our homeland. Himmat, Himmat can change our garden. Don't give me bread. I'm not hungry. Don't give me a stick. I'm not blind. Don't tease me. I'm not a child. If we stand up as teachers, if we stand up as leaders, if we stand up as farmers, then Himmat, Himmat can change our homeland. Himmat, Himmat can change our garden. If we have all of these things, then why are we idle and passive? Why are the fruits of our tree so small and weak? Let us take good care of this tree, and then we will taste how the fruits are sweet and good. Himmat, Himmat can change our homeland. Himmat, Himmat can change our garden.
So next slide. So we developed a training program, which was able to be, it was not like a formal course, it was people sat in circles in communities and were able to go through these training books themselves, as long as you had somebody who was literate. And I mean, it astonished us and humbled us, because 12,000 people in these high mountain villages, you know, that's a huge proportion of the adult population, have taken these courses. And it has had a huge impact on all facets of development. You can see from their faces. Next slide. Another part was village councils, women's councils, you know, regional development councils. These kinds of institutions needed to be strengthened. Before councils were formed by somebody appointed them, they weren't chosen by the people. So that was a big step. These councils reporting to people and working with the people, not just doing their own thing in some kind of a vacuum. And then just getting, you know, basic skills. Here's a village council treasurer getting a lesson in bookkeeping. So hundreds of these local and area development councils were nurtured and brought into the area of functioning, and they're all run by volunteers. But they were able to coordinate a wide range of social and economic improvement initiatives.
Let me just say that we didn't start these councils. They were there when we got there, but 80% of them were not functioning. People just kind of walked away from them because they weren't participatory, they weren't democratic, and they didn't have confidence in them. So mostly what we did is reactivate them and build their capacity to do a lot more, particularly focusing on women's organizations that weren't really participating in development decision-making or project making or anything, but now hundreds of them are. For example, in the last few years, we've created, or they've created, I think we're approaching like 45 revolving funds that are run by
that part's coming in just a moment.
Organizations. Well, I like it here.
Okay, well, let's introduce the topic. That one of the things we promised to talk to you about was just how do you get small economic development happening, and what's the impact of that?
You go. Well, I'll start and then you pick up the next part.
Yeah, please.
So to start off with.
So the next slide, please, Rick.
I want to tell you that we had a business expert, a person who had been running companies in Europe all of his life. And he was working with the project, and he worked 3 years, and people kept submitting proposals for the businesses they wanted to do, and he kept sending it back and saying, not good enough, not big enough, not this, not that. After 3 years, there wasn't a single business, because the basic idea of business that he had was get them to produce something that you can sell to Europe, to sell abroad, sell in the big cities in Karachi or Islamabad, like that. So we said, okay, that's enough of that. 3 years, no businesses at all. So we developed a course on small business development and what economic development actually is. And Judie, I think we should tell them a little bit about that learning process.
Yeah, we just have to be quick because we've got 10 minutes left for the rest of it. But yes, I think so too.
You're in good time, folks. Good time.
We're
Carry on.
galloping. We're galloping, Rick, but we're still on the horse.
Next slide, please.
People said, we can't do business. We don't have capital. We don't know how to do business. And besides, we're isolated. And like, what does that mean in our context? And so in the training program, I have to admit that we made some fake money on the Xerox machine, sort of like Monopoly money. I guess you're not supposed to do that, but we invited people there was like 120 or 150 people in every time we had a workshop, because they were hosted by the village. We didn't pay for training space. We didn't pay for travel. I mean, people made huge sacrifices to come to these, and villages, they volunteered to host these meetings and did such a magnificent job. Anyway, so they're there, and we each gave them each a piece of paper, and we said, just divide it in half, and on one half, write all the things that you would like to be able to buy. And on the other half, all of the things that you could offer other people. They could be goods or services, like your apricots or your carpentry skill or whatever. And then we said, okay, so now go for it. See how many transactions you can have, where you can find somebody who wants something that you have, and you can find somebody who has something that you want, and see if you can do this kind of just exchange. And we let them go for 20 minutes, and then we called them back, and there was like hundreds of transactions, 400 maybe transactions. And we said, how did you like that game? They said, that's not a game. We'd forgotten. That's how we used to do things. We need to think about the things that we need locally and how we can exchange them. So then we asked them just to close their eyes and to think about the little market town that was the nearest place where they bought things, and said, just walk down in your mind, walk down that street and ask yourself this question: who owns those shops? Why isn't it you? And what is it that you could be selling there? And out of that came this just fluorescence of people's ideas about businesses. Just to give an example that we like to give, and you see in the bottom left hand of the screen, there's a woman in a small shop. That's what women wanted to do. They wanted to have small stores in their villages, because if you have to travel 6 hours to get to a store, and if it's only the men that go, guess what? It's not working. It's not working for the women and for the children, the things that they need. They wanted to have small shops. So we offered each village some support for 3 small economic projects, one done by women, one done by men, and one done by youth. And the women wanted to start these shops. So we gave them initially $75, which is really nothing. To start a store, you have to have a place, you have to buy stock, you have to run the business long enough that you can begin to turn a profit. But they said, we took that course, so we sit down together and we talk about this. And the first thing they said is, we all invest. So everybody gave $1. So this group of women, say 10 women or 15 women, are doing this collaboratively. And then they think, if that's not enough, what can we do? And they decided that they knew somebody who had moved to the capital, and they said, that guy is making money, we'll ask him to be an investor. And so they started these shops. We came back 6 months later, and they just were actually running onto the road to meet us. They wanted us to see their ledgers, because not just one, but a number of these shops had $10,000 worth of assets in 6 months from a $75 investment and their own huge commitment and investment. So that's the power of the local economy. And that's just one example of the power of the local economy. So we mobilize that through these quick win projects, which we offered people, and we didn't tell them what these had to be, even though we thought, that's a kind of quirky idea, but what do we know? And just like we say, amazing things happen. Next slide. So we have more than 300 new small businesses, and a lot of them focused on food and agriculture as one aspect of it. Right now, there's a bunch of new women's shops that are catering to domestic tourism by offering all sorts of traditional foods as kind of cafes. Then next slide. So then, as Michael said, we have been trained and offered small support to women's organizations to start revolving funds. So these are funds where people save, and then they loan out to people who want to start businesses and charge a small service fee of maybe 10%, because the banks charge 22%. And that 10% helps the women's organization to be able to do village improvement projects. So this is like they have their own financial institution there now.
And the other thing about this concept is that the women's organizations own and operate these funds, so that when the loans come back in with the 10% interest, that 10% they can choose to put it back into more loans, or they could use that money to help sustain and operate their women's organization. It can be like a little profitable business for them.
And there's just so many other examples of, the ingenuity and resilience and tremendous outcomes that we have seen, which we could not have imagined. And if we had tried to have a project that was determined to have certain outcomes, we would just have been in the way. I mean, they said to us one time, guess what we did while you were away? And they started credit unions, because the banks not only are so far away, but the banks charge 22% interest and won't loan to them anyway, because they're considered too poor. Next slide. We're going to make it here. Next slide.
We're doing just fine. So
Michael.
this off-kilter drawing, which I don't know why we use, because it's wacko, is basically saying that human beings learn through experience. So something happens in your life and then you learn from it. So that's action. And then you think about it, that's reflection. So you learn something from that. Well, you either learn through the reflection, or you learn because you tried, you got some advice from somebody, or you read something. And then you take all of that and you put it together into the next round of planning that will guide the next action. So it's action, reflection, learning, and planning, and it goes round and round and around.
In short, we encourage people to do that in short cycles, of not more than 3 months, where they do this on a collective level. What did we do? What did we learn from that? What do we need to learn? What's our next plan? And we go around the circle again. Next slide.
This process that we're describing to you, that's a road, by the way, a real road, and it goes to one of the remote villages in the area called Shimshal.
No, that's the KKH, Michael.
Okay. I dispute that, but anyway, it's a road. It's one of the roads that we had to ride on, and it's long and it's bumpy and it's difficult, but that's the nature of this work. The folks that are working with us on the ground, we have, well, right now we have 7 or 8 full-time employees, full and part-time employees that are working on this thing. And all along, we've hired local staff, trained them, and they're the ones that are actually running this project. And sooner or later, they make the observation, you know, if you want long-term results, you got to go long. This takes a long time, but it's steady and you build capacity, and it doesn't go away after the project is done, because the project never really is done, because it's life.
Next
Yeah.
slide.
To get long-term results, you have to go long. So the process of development, as we're working there, we're coming to the end of one global grant right now. We're raising money ourselves to keep the team going for the next 4 or 5 months, 6 months, however long it takes for us to get the next global grant to do the next round of work. Our project started off in those high mountains, but this year we've also moved down to the lowlands in South Punjab, where a lot of flooding has happened, but not exactly in our project area. Where as we were working in the summertime, it was 47 degrees, and it was so hot that it killed the citrus crop, and 1/3 of all food crops died. Climate change is just killing this area. And in that area, 40% of children are stunted. They have school, but the teachers never show up. They have a healthcare center, but healthcare workers in medicine just aren't there. So you can see that it's an area that's going to need a lot of work as well. And that change is not going to come by petitioning government. It's going to change because people in communities get their act together and start moving and building things. And that's how we work.
Next slide. Just say that our whole budget for this project even with the global grant, our budget was like $80,000 a year. We're working with 120 villages up in the high mountains and also this other area. That's peanuts. That's the same amount of money that one development worker that works for a big organization makes as a salary. And we're doing all of this on that. You can get big results without big money. Next slide. And we say, don't scale up, scale out, because you have to look at the context every single time. You can't just replicate. Last slide, I guess that's it.
Isn't that the last slide? Those little kids are the last slide, yeah.
Yeah.
That idea of scaling up, I know people have asked us, can you come and do this? Only do it with 50 villages or 150 villages over here? And we say, no. We can come and build a process that will grow into that, but it won't happen the same way that it happened where we were working before. But there are principles and concepts that can be applied, and a lot of the learning materials too. That's maybe it, Rick.
Yeah, so questions.
Thanks, Judy and Michael. What an incredible story. Again, I learned something from you, and I think you really stressed the importance of development coming from within the local communities, not people going in and telling them what they need, but to get them to self-actuate and engage and bring forward their own ideas. And the story about the markets and the in those villages, I'm just amazed. And I realize it is a long-term project, so I want to thank both of you. We do have some questions in the Q&A, I see. Frank asked the question, and I'm not sure which Frank it is because I don't see the full name, but what triggered you to believe that the people had a need for help? Either one of you want to take that one on?
Well, first of all, as we explained, when we first started working there, people were in a desperate situation because of the Audubon landslide. They had lost everything, and they were living on tea and chapatis for months and months at a time. They didn't have adequate nutrition. They didn't have heat. They were in a desperate situation. we got kind of shepherded into that context by the Other Kind Development Organization, which is a big development organization, who said, we're not really serving these people. But then, as Michael explained, the tree of development showed, they explained why they wanted to partner with us. And then we fell in love. These
There
are
is
amazing,
that.
amazing people.
Just from that tree of fruit and the roots, that's quite an icon, I would say.
Well, here's another way to think about that question also. In any population anywhere in the world, you can ask this question: what do you need to have in your life in order to have a good and healthy life? And people will say, well, besides sex and chocolate, they'll be, I need income, I need safety and security, I need healthcare, I need education. They'll go on listing all those things. Those were the fruits of the tree of development. So it's pretty straightforward that you can look at a situation that people are in and listen to them, and you can hear quite readily that those things that determine human well-being are happening or not happening, or they're doing well or they're not doing well, and they will tell you. And so then, if you're in dialogue with them, the next natural step is, well, what's next for you, and what sort of help do you need? Or if you want to be of assistance, it's not hard to get into dialogue with people. And all you have to do is open your eyes and look, and you can see when people are in dire circumstances.
Sigrid Deutschlander asked the question, how do you approach gender inequity?
That's a good question, because you can anticipate that there's gender inequity there, and indeed there was. But rather than taking we did take a strong stand in one way. We told the communities, if you want us to support you, when we have training sessions, at least 40% of the participants have to be women. And that was just a benchmark that we gave them. And, when women started, and then we offered separate quick win projects for women and for men, so that women would have the opportunity. And when women started having $10,000 of assets after 6 months, the men said, wait a minute, how do we get in on this? And you began to have a real change in household dynamics and in community dynamics. It doesn't mean that you still would have some kind of a gold standard of equity, but we were there at the end of May in Pakistan, and the women were sharing with us and with the team from South Punjab about what they had learned and what they had achieved. And they were they didn't talk in public when this project started. And they were there, just their faces were glowing, and they were so articulate and so passionate about what they were doing. So little by little, and then they said, do you think this is easy? No, we still get crap sometimes, but we're here and we're changing our communities in terms of gender inequity. So little by little, and just finding what are those doorways that you have to start the process.
Good on you for setting the expectations of that 40% level right up front, and sounds like everybody bought into it.
Well, not exactly. I'll just say that several times we showed up for a training session or a planning meeting, and only the men were there, and we just basically said, well, guys, let us know when you can bring the women and we'll come back, and we left.
Good
so the word got out really quickly.
That took some courage, I would say. Steve Levitt is asking, could you see the same type of program working on our local Indigenous reserves? I presume yes, but you want to comment on that, one of you?
Yes, it can. We've been working for 30 years in Indigenous communities, and it is the same kind of process, but we're extremely careful to be working behind and sort of with and in support of Indigenous people, with their leadership out in front. You
And
have
there
here,
have been huge changes in Indigenous communities over the last 30 years since we've been doing this work. I mean, it can be easy to see the challenges, it can be easy to see the suffering, but there have been, in many communities, huge positive steps forward.
Each one being different, of course.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. Okay, next one. Valerie Mashinsky has asked, do you see this process applying for community initiatives in Calgary? And if yes, how would Rotary engage?
I want to take that one and give an example that we work for a number of years with the South Sudanese community. And they were relatively, at that time, unorganized in terms of community development. And all we did was sit with them in circles and ask them to bring their people together and encourage them to consult. And we didn't provide any ideas or leadership really other than the framework within which they could consult and eventually to develop an organization that could be kind of guide development work. So our role, we went as human beings. I don't say we went as Rotarians, we just were human beings and we were there. And a lot of it is connecting with hearts, is loving the people, is caring for the people, and just being there week in and week out. Like during the pandemic was really hard on that community. A lot of people were suffering, and just being there to support them. And it's difficult, and they're traumatized people too. So it's not easy to work with them because hurt people, but you're still there and you stick with them. That kind of collaborative partnership with any group of people in the city will gradually bear fruit if you're humble and you just commit yourself to a path of service.
You start with relationships, you move on to some kind of constructive processes you're doing together, and then you can move on to creating some kind of structures like a committee or a organization or whatever.
I think you've answered Ellen McMillan's question, how can you apply these principles to local community projects? And I think, Judy, you've just answered it by starting with relationships and then develop workable processes. The last question we have is from Rhea Graham. How did you engage the youth? You mentioned the youth. You mentioned men, women, and youth. Could you comment on that?
Mm-hmm. When we were in areas, we would sometimes, the teachers were often quite active in the process because they're well educated compared to a lot of other people in the village. And so we would encourage them to bring the high school kids to the workshops, to the sessions, which they were only too happy to do because then they could be there too. And what happened when we introduced democratic processes for choosing leaders, then the youth said, all right, now we're in. Because this is accountable, this is transparent, this is fair, now we're in. And then, for example, like they have Boy Scouts there, but it's not sort of like Boy Scouts here, it's a young men who do service. The Boy Scout leader for the area said, well, this is a good thing. I'm going to give these training books. We're going to do them with all the Boy Scouts in the country, in this region. So then we had 500, young people getting involved and engaged and so on. And then just the kind of cultural context there in Islamic countries is service. And so young people were expected to do community service, and we invited them to be able to participate in a way that was meaningful for them.
And the other thing we did is put resources in the hands of youth and said, you guys want to do something? Here, go ahead and do it. So one example,
empowered them.
Yeah.
One example is a group of youth put forward a proposal and they said, we want to get donkeys, and we want to have a mobile library that can go house to house in the wintertime when the schools are closed and the kids are lapsing in their reading ability, and we'll bring them books. Was it?
Oh, wow. Wow.
Here you go.
Hmm. I do have one last question here. I think we have time for it if people will allow us to go maybe a couple of minutes after 8. But this one comes from Stephen Gasser, and I think it's a relevant question. Can you give some examples of objectives that were used in your project to demonstrate sustainability that to RI for your global grant?
Yeah, good one. um, I mean, there's a big difference between sort of outputs and outcomes, as Stephen I'm sure knows. And so you can count up how many people, like 12,000 people took the training program, 300 businesses started, 45 women's organizations began having revolving funds and so on. But the sustainable impacts is a different kind of challenge, and it's a different, unfortunately, when you do reporting to RI, they don't ask you really about your sustainable impacts. They ask you about your activities and what happened. But we have, Stephen, if you would like to get in touch with us, we have impact report that you might be able to see how we, upped a notch there in terms of reporting what happened.
But one thing for sure is that we say if you're not building capacity, then it's not development. But if you are building capacity, that's sustainable right there. The capacity doesn't disappear no matter what else happens. So we have a lot of evidence of capacity development, where before women were just in their homes and in the agricultural fields. Now there's hundreds of them running their own businesses, and there's many, many of them running their own organizations. None of that was happening before. So that's evidence of capacity that goes beyond us and any money. That's the
Evidence
sort
of
of
sustainability
Yeah,
through capacity building.
exactly.
Yeah. Well,
And the
we're at
fact
the.
that
Go
just
ahead.
the fact that during these hard times, I mean, these people aren't paid, they're volunteers. Like, I can't stress enough. Our contribution is a tiny fraction of what it takes to make the changes that we've seen. They have put in so much, and that's, to me, a sustainability.
Judie Michael, thanks very much for sharing your story this evening about your experience. I found it quite informative, and again, thank you for your time. I want to thank the 35 participants, our audience that sat in and gave us an hour of their time this evening. To everyone that participated in tonight's session, look for a PDF of the PowerPoint slide that Judie and Michael prepared. That will be in your email inbox later this week. And also just a reminder that our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, October the 19th. The webinar is entitled Social Media in Plain Language. This will be presented by Robin Braley, a member of the Calgary West Rotary Club. You will learn the keys to social media success through content creation basics and why Facebook is important and how to get the most out of it. So thank you, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, the video will be uploaded onto our district YouTube website probably within the next week, and you will be sent a link for that one as well. So you could, for those, I know that there are several that couldn't make it tonight, and this was their way of catching up. So again, thanks everybody, and have a good evening.